Don't let the titans of this city see you falter, girl. The manager, Marcus, hissed the words like escaping steam, his breath sour with the day's third espresso. You crawled out of some forgotten alley. Don't you dare stain our carpets with its dust. Alara Vance offered no reply, her spine straight as she lifted the silver tray. In the opulent dining room of the Gilded Cage, she had learned that silence was her only armor. Colleagues like the perfectly coiffed Brielle offered smiles as sharp as broken glass. Wealthy guests looked through her as if she were made of air, and at the corner table, the billionaire Kalen Sterling ordered his drink with a voice so cold it could have frozen the amber liquid in his glass. The air in the Gilded Cage was thick with the scent of money, a cloying perfume of roasted duck and aged wine. Ilara moved through it like a ghost in her stark black and white uniform, a stark contrast to the glittering jewels and shimmering silks of the clientele. She had mastered the art of being invisible, a necessary skill for survival. Her movements were economical and precise, each step measured to avoid drawing attention. She was not of this world, she was merely a function within it, a pair of hands to deliver pleasure and clear away the remnants. Hey, if this story is hitting you, do me a favor, grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below about what this moment means to you, and subscribe to the channel. Tonight, Kalen Sterling sat alone, a solitary king surveying his kingdom through the vast panoramic window. His name was etched onto half the buildings that pierced the city's skyline. He was a myth, a legend of commerce, a man whose gaze was said to be able to assess the value of a company or a soul in a single dismissive glance. To Alara, he was simply Order Number 17, a Macallan 25, neat. She approached his table with the practiced calm she reserved for the most intimidating patrons. As she set down the decadent chocolate torte, a sliver of gold leaf trembling on its surface, the light from the grand crystal chandelier struck the ring on her finger. It was her mother's, a heavy, unadorned silver band holding a single, deep blue stone that seemed to trap the light within its depths, like a captured flame. It was a phoenix ring. Her mother had once whispered during a rare moment of clarity, though she couldn't remember from where it came. Alara had borrowed it this morning for luck, a small, secret comfort against the day's expected abrasions. Kalen's eyes, which had been fixed on the sprawling city below, snapped to the flash of blue light on the white tablecloth. His fork, halfway to his mouth, froze in midair. For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't looking at her, but at the ring, his face a mask of disbelief. Ilara didn't know why she said it. The words felt as if they were spoken by someone else, a soft, unthinking whisper that slipped past her lips like a sigh. "Sir, my mother has a ring just like that." The effect was instantaneous and violent. The color drained from Kalen Sterling's face, leaving behind a waxy, pale canvas. His eyes bulged. One hand, trembling uncontrollably, clutched at his chest as a strangled gasp escaped his throat. Then, before the entire hushed restaurant, he collapsed. His body struck the table with a sickening thud that echoed louder than the clinking glasses and muted conversations. The room spun into chaos. A woman screamed. Waiters shouted for a doctor. Alara stood frozen, the silver tray trembling in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She just stared at the fallen billionaire sprawled across the starched white linen, his overturned whiskey glass pooling like blood. On her finger, the phoenix ring suddenly burned, a brand of ice and fire. The chaos that erupted was a maelstrom of panic and privilege. Marcus was the first to reach her, his face contorted with a fury that was part fear, part raw anger. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "What did you do?" he hissed, dragging her away from the scene and towards the swinging doors of the kitchen. "What did you put in his food?" The accusation was a slap, sharp and stunning. In the stainless steel glare of the kitchen, Alara pulled her arm free, her jaw tight. "Nothing," she said, her voice a low, steady thread in the cacophony of shouting chefs and clattering pans. "I just set down the dessert." Marcus's eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. "You said something to him. I saw you. What was it?" Alara met his gaze, her dark eyes calm but unyielding. The silence was her answer, a shield he could not penetrate. He stepped back, muttering threats about lawsuits and the restaurant's reputation, his authority dissolving into blustering fear. Around her, the kitchen staff watched with a mixture of awe and contempt. Brielle, leaning against a prep counter with a smirk, whispered loudly to a line cook, "Hands that shaky will shatter a baccarat crystal any second." The snickers that followed were like stones thrown at her back. Alara ignored them. She walked through the gauntlet of their judgment, her posture unbroken. She had heard worse. Growing up, the other children had called her and her mother gutter rats because of the tiny, drafty apartment they called home. They didn't know about the quiet dignity of her mother, Annalise, who, even in the fog of her fractured memory, would hum lullabies with a voice that could hush a storm. They didn't know that Alara had taught herself to read by the dim glow of a flashlight when the power was inevitably cut off. The next morning, the storm broke beyond the walls of the restaurant. A small, folded piece of paper had been slipped under her apartment door. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smudged. "Stay away from the Sterlings, or you'll wish you were never born." No signature. Her breath caught in her throat. In the other room, Annalise was still asleep, her soft snores a gentle rhythm in the quiet apartment. Alara folded the note and tucked it deep into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cool silver of the phoenix ring she'd put on again out of a defiant habit. She didn't tell her mother, she didn't call the police. Who would believe her? She simply locked the door, the sound of the bolts sliding home echoing the lockdown in her own heart, and went to make coffee, her steps quiet, as if she were afraid of waking something far more dangerous than her mother. The world outside had already passed its verdict. The whispers followed her down the street. Neighbors who used to offer a friendly nod now peered at her from behind drawn curtains. The man at the corner store, who usually saved her the day-old bread, barely met her eyes as he took her money. She felt their stares like a physical weight, a shroud of suspicion woven from gossip and fear. That evening, as she sat with her mother, sharing a simple meal of soup and bread, Alara felt the chasm between her quiet life and the violent storm she had unleashed. The phoenix ring on her finger felt heavier than ever, no longer a piece of her mother, but a link to a dangerous, unknown world that now knew her name. Within 48 hours, Alara Vance's name was no longer a whisper. It was a headline. A grainy photograph, taken from the restaurant's security footage, was splashed across the front page of the city's most notorious tabloid. Waitress and the fallen tycoon. Accident or ambition? The article was a masterpiece of insinuation, painting her as a mysterious siren, a schemer who had somehow brought the city's most powerful man to his knees with a single, secret word. The consequences were swift and brutal. An official letter arrived by courier, the thick, creamy stationery feeling more expensive than her weekly rent. It was from the Gilded Cage. For causing grievous damage to the establishment's reputation, it read, "Your employment is suspended indefinitely." It was a firing, wrapped in polite, corporate language. Alara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the words until they blurred. In the next room, she could hear Annalise humming that same haunting lullaby, the one melody that had survived the shipwreck of her memory. It was her mother's nervous habit, a sound that had once been a comfort but now felt like the soundtrack to their unraveling lives. Her part-time job at a quiet, dusty bookstore, once her sanctuary, became another stage for her public humiliation. A customer, a man in a tailored coat with a voice accustomed to being obeyed, pointed a finger at her as she scanned his books. "You're the one from the papers, aren't you?" He boomed, loud enough for the entire queue to turn and stare. "Trying to scam your way into a fortune, are we?" Alara's hands remained steady, but her jaw tightened. "No scam," she said, her voice flat, her eyes meeting his for a brief, defiant second. He scoffed and snatched his bag, but the damage was done. The other customers kept glancing her way, their whispers like the rustle of dry, dead leaves. She finished her shift, her back straight, her face a mask of calm, but her fingers never stopped twisting the phoenix ring, a desperate, grounding gesture. The cruelty of the outside world soon breached the thin walls of their apartment. At the weekend market, as Alara was helping Annalise pick out apples, a vendor leaned over her stall, her eyes sharp and malicious. "That's her," she said to another customer, her voice a stage whisper meant to carry. "The one who made the Billionaire collapse. Bad luck, that one. Best to stay away." Annalise's hand froze over a bright red apple, her face crumbling as if she had been struck. The light in her eyes dimmed. Alara gently took her mother's arm. "Let's go home, Mom." She didn't look back, but she could feel the stares, the judgment trailing them like smoke. Annalise was silent the entire walk home, her steps slow, her shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. That evening, Annalise sat in her favorite armchair, her hands twisting in her lap. "Don't do this, Alara," she pleaded, her voice thin and breaking. "Don't dig up the past. I can't bear their contempt. I can't bear their eyes on us." Alara knelt before her, taking her mother's trembling hands in her own. She saw the raw fear in her mother's eyes, a terror that went deeper than newspaper headlines. It was the terror of a past she couldn't remember, but could still feel like a phantom limb that ached with old wounds. A profound, agonizing conflict tore through Alara. The world was punishing her for a question she hadn't even meant to ask. But now, seeing the pain it caused her mother, she wondered if the price of any possible truth was simply too high to pay. Just when Alara felt the walls of her world closing in, a sleek black limousine, silent as a panther, pulled up outside her crumbling apartment building. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, their gossip buzzing like flies against window panes. A man in a severe gray suit stepped out, his face carved from granite. He did not knock on her door, but stood waiting, an immovable object of corporate power. Alara met him on the cracked pavement, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Alara Vance?" the man asked, though it wasn't a question. He handed her an engraved card. "Julian Croft, Chief Counsel, Sterling Corporation. Mr. Sterling requests your presence. This is not an invitation." The hospital was a different universe. Plush red carpets muffled their footsteps, and the air smelled of antiseptic and wealth. Staff members bowed their heads as Julian Croft led her through silent, pristine corridors. It felt more like a palace than a place for the sick. In the VIP suite, Kalen Sterling lay in a bed that resembled a modern throne. He was pale, but his eyes, clear and sharp, locked onto her the moment she entered. He gestured to a chair. She sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the phoenix ring feeling like a lead weight. "That ring," Kalen said, his voice raspy but firm, bypassing all pleasantries. He stared at her hand. "I forged it myself, 20 years ago, for my wife Serafina. It vanished with her in the Bixby Bridge accident. They told me she was gone. They never found the ring." He paused, his gaze boring into her, searching for a flicker of deceit. "Why does your mother have it?" Alara's breath hitched. Bixby Bridge, 20 years ago. The words resonated with a vague, terrifying familiarity. She thought of her mother, Annalise, who had woken up in a charity hospital 2 decades ago, with no name, no past, no memory, just the ring on her finger and a lullaby on her lips. "I don't know," she said, her voice miraculously steady. She doesn't remember anything before that day. Reese Sterling, Kalen's cousin, stood near the window, his arms crossed. He had a smile that was smooth as oil and just as slippery. "Cousin, please," he interjected, his tone dripping with false concern. "Don't let emotions blind you. This is clearly a well-rehearsed story. A poor girl with a convenient piece of jewelry, hoping to exploit a tragedy. And Alara's jaw clenched, but she held her tongue. She could feel Reese's contempt like a physical force, but Kalen's eyes remained on her, his expression a mixture of desperate hope and profound suspicion. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Bring your mother," he commanded. "Tomorrow." That night, Alara couldn't sleep. A frantic energy propelled her to the small, dusty attic of their building. She was looking for something, anything. Under a pile of old blankets, her fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of a wooden box. Inside, her world tilted on its axis. There was a photograph, creased and faded, of a young, radiant Annalise, holding hands with a man who was unmistakably a younger Kalen Sterling. The phoenix ring gleamed on her finger. Beneath the photo lay a hospital wristband, yellowed with age. The name typed on it stark and clinical, Jane Doe. The date printed below it was from the week of the Bixby Bridge accident. Tucked into a corner was a torn piece of paper with faint ink stamping the words, Harmony Creek Hospital. The pieces didn't just fit. They slammed together with the force of a revelation. Annalise was Serafina, and if that was true, then she was their daughter. Alara's hands shook as she held the fragments of her stolen past, her heart pounding with a terrifying, exhilarating truth. The next day, Alara didn't bring her mother. She brought the box. She walked past Reese in the hospital corridor, ignoring his sneering gaze, and entered Kalen's suite. She laid the contents on the sterile bedside table without a word. The faded photograph, the Jane Doe wristband, the hospital scrap. Kalen stared at the photo, his fingers tracing the image of the smiling young woman with a reverence that bordered on pain. "Serafina," he whispered, his voice breaking. The mask of the ruthless billionaire dissolved, revealing the grieving husband underneath. He looked from the photo to Alara, and for the first time, he wasn't looking for a lie. He was searching for a reflection. Julian Croft, standing nearby, picked up the wristband, his expression grim and focused. "I will look into this personally," he said, his voice low and serious. The air in the room was charged with unspoken possibilities. While Julian launched a discreet and thorough investigation, Reese Sterling intensified his public and private war against Alara. In the grand boardroom of Sterling Corporation, he was a master performer. "She fabricates these lies to claw her way into our family," he declared, his voice ringing with manufactured outrage. "This is nothing more than a desperate, money-grabbing scheme. Recognizing her would ruin the Sterling reputation. We cannot let a waitress from the slums taint our legacy." The board members, men of old money and new power, nodded in agreement, their faces masks of disdain. They saw Alara not as a person, but as a threat to their stable, ordered world. The smear campaign escalated. Paparazzi swarmed Alara and Annalise at the market, their cameras flashing like gunfire. Headlines screamed, "Poor families plot to steal a fortune." Neighbors, fueled by the relentless media narrative, became hostile, banging on their door at night, shouting, "Frauds! Leave the Sterlings alone!" The pressure became unbearable. One evening, Annalise collapsed, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to come from a place deeper than the present. As Alara called for an ambulance, her hands shaking, she felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't just about truth anymore, it was about survival. A week later, Julian Croft summoned her to his office. The room was lined with law books, a temple of facts and evidence. He had a single, thick file on his polished mahogany desk. "Hospital records," he began, his voice devoid of emotion as he slid them across to her. "Harmony Creek, 20 years ago, an unidentified woman, Jane Doe, was admitted with severe amnesia after being found near the Bixby Bridge wreckage." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. A week later, her file was altered. A significant payout was made to a junior administrator to change her status to deceased and have her transferred to a state-run long-term care facility miles away. "The money," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "has been traced. It came from a shell company, one owned by Reese Sterling." Alara's breath caught. The pieces clicked into a horrifying mosaic. Julian leaned forward, his voice a low, hard whisper. "There's more." According to Kalen's old files, Serafina had scheduled a meeting with him the day after the accident. She had found proof of massive embezzlement within the corporation. The scheme was being run by Reese. The accident was no accident. It was an attempt to silence her. Reese hadn't just tried to murder his cousin's wife. He had buried her alive under a false name, erasing her from the world, and had let Kalen grieve for 2 decades. Alara's hands clenched into fists on the desk. She didn't speak, she just nodded, her jaw tight, her gaze as hard as steel. The fight was no longer just hers. It was for the life that had been stolen from her mother. The emergency board meeting was a tribunal. Reese Sterling stood at the head of the long, polished table, basking in what he believed was his final victory. He had just finished a stirring speech about protecting the Sterling legacy from opportunistic parasites. The board members were murmuring in agreement, ready to vote on a restraining order and a public denouncement of Alara Vance. The doors swung open. Kalen Sterling walked in, not in a hospital gown, but in a perfectly tailored suit. He looked older, tired, but his eyes held a fire that silenced the room. Julian Croft followed, carrying a leather briefcase. Alara stood in the doorway, a silent observer. "The traitor is not outside these walls," Kalen announced, his voice cold as a tombstone. "He is in our own blood." He nodded to Julian, who laid open a file on the table, revealing bank statements, forged documents, and a sworn affidavit from the retired hospital administrator. The proof was laid bare for all to see. Reese's face turned from crimson to ashen white. "Lies!" he shrieked, his composure shattering. "Fabrications from a cheap waitress and a senile old man." But the room was silent. The board members stared at the papers, their faces pale with the sudden, undeniable truth. Reese, cornered and exposed, lunged toward Alara, his face a mask of pure hatred. "No one will ever believe you, a nobody." Alara didn't flinch. She looked him directly in the eye, her voice quiet but sharp as a razor. "They don't have to," she said. "The truth believes itself." Days later, Kalen called a press conference. The room was a feeding frenzy of reporters and flashing cameras. Alara sat on the podium between Kalen and her mother, Annalise. Annalise was quiet, her hands folded in her lap, the phoenix ring gleaming under the bright lights, seeming to draw all the energy in the room towards it. The questions were brutal, a barrage of accusations disguised as journalism. "Miss Vance, how do you explain finding these proofs right when Mr. Sterling was vulnerable? Are you prepared for the fraud lawsuit the Sterling board was planning? You expect us to believe this elaborate story based on a single ring?" Alara answered when she had to, her voice calm, her words measured. She wasn't there to convince them. She was simply there to stand by her mother. As the attacks grew more vicious, a strange thing happened. Annalise began to hum. It was soft at first, a private, half-conscious sound. But then, it grew louder, clearer. It was the lullaby. The haunting, beautiful melody filled the silent room, a fragile thread of sound weaving through the tense atmosphere. The reporters' pens froze. The cameras stopped flashing. Everyone stared at the woman with the vacant eyes who was producing this impossibly lovely, heartbreaking tune. Kalen, who had been standing stoically at the podium, turned. His eyes widened in stunned recognition. The melody was a secret language between him and his wife, a song he had composed for her, one that no one else in the world knew. The last vestiges of his doubt crumbled into dust. He sank to his knees before his wife's chair, his powerful shoulders shaking. His voice, when he spoke, was a ragged whisper that was picked up by every microphone in the room. "Serafina, you're alive," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "Oh God, no one else knows that song. Oh." In that moment, the truth was not found in a DNA test or a legal document. It was revealed in the notes of a forgotten melody, an immortal love song that had survived memory, tragedy, and 20 years of silence. The world watched, breathless, as a billionaire wept at the feet of a woman named Jane Doe, and a family, long thought dead, was reborn. The aftermath was a tidal wave. The DNA test results that came back the next day were a mere formality, a scientific stamp on a truth the world had already witnessed. Alara Vance was Kalen Sterling's daughter. Annalise was Serafina Sterling, his wife, lost for 20 years. The headlines shifted from skepticism to awe. The Phoenix's daughter, they called Alara, with photos of her standing tall and composed beside her reunited parents. Justice, once a distant hope, arrived with swift, unforgiving force. Reese Sterling was arrested, his crimes of embezzlement, fraud, and attempted murder laid bare for a scandal-hungry public. The board members who had supported him issued groveling public apologies. The ripples of change spread outward, touching everyone who had played a part in Alara's ordeal. Marcus, the sneering manager, was fired, his name disgraced in the papers. Brielle, the waitress with the cruel smile, found her social media flooded with comments calling out her bullying, and she was quietly let go. The wealthy, diamond-clad women from the restaurant, who had looked down their noses at Alara, suddenly found their invitations to the city's most exclusive galas rescinded, their social standing evaporating overnight. A week later, the annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala was the event of the season. Alara arrived unannounced, walking through the grand entrance alone. She wore a simple, elegant dark blue dress that stood in stark contrast to the sea of glittering sequins and extravagant gowns. The room hushed as she passed, whispers trailing her like the train of a gown she did not wear. One of the women from the restaurant, dripping in diamonds, spotted her. She let out a laugh, loud enough to draw attention. "Still chasing fame, are you?" she said, her voice dripping with the same old scorn, unwilling to accept the new reality. "Some people just don't know when the show is over." Alara stopped. She turned and looked at the woman, her gaze steady and clear, holding no malice, only a quiet certainty. "I'm just here to donate," she said calmly. She walked to the main donation table and placed a check upon it. The amount was discreetly folded, but the signature was clear and bold. Alara Vance Sterling. The woman's smile froze on her painted lips, her champagne flute trembling in her hand. Alara had not raised her voice, had not flashed her newfound wealth. She had answered cruelty with grace, and condescension with quiet purpose. It was a checkmate delivered in a whisper. She walked on, her steps light, the check left on the table like a quiet declaration of who she now was, and more importantly, who she had always been. She didn't need to go back to the restaurant. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Her victory was not in the headlines or the bank accounts. It was in the quiet hospital room where she watched her father hold her mother's hand, his fingers intertwined with hers as if they had never been parted. Serafina's memory was returning in fragments, like shards of a beautiful mosaic being pieced back together, often prompted by Kaylin's gentle stories of their past. Julian Croft stood by the door, his usual stern expression softened by something that looked almost like pride. Alara didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just watched, her hands steady, her heart full. The world now knew her name, but it didn't matter. She had always known who she was. She picked up her simple cloth bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out of the room. Her steps were light but sure, the steps of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged, not burned, but forged. For everyone who had ever been looked down on, judged, or pushed aside, Alara's story was a quiet triumph. She had not shouted. Her life, lived with quiet integrity, had spoken for her. And in the silence that followed the storm, you could almost hear a lullaby carried on the wind,